Wonderful. Welcome. Welcome, folks, to Birthrights Bar Association and National Advocates for Pregnant Women's third in our series of webinars related to childbirth and the law. I am Indra Lucero, the president of the Birthrights Bar Association and a staff attorney with National Advocates for Pregnant Women. And I am thrilled and delighted to be offering this webinar today as part of Black Maternal Health Week. I'm going to introduce my esteemed colleague, who I'm delighted to have moderating this panel, and then I will hand it over to her and the panelists. So first, I want to thank you all for being here and also mention a little bit about Birthrights Bar Association. The Birthrights Bar Association was founded in order to develop a network and community of legal advocates addressing all sorts of issues related to childbirth and the law. Many of you are members, and if not, we welcome, community members as well as academic members, and of course, legal and lawyer members. The goal is really to build our capacity as a network to address the issues like we're going to be talking about today. We also will have subsequent webinars. We do these once a month. So look out for May's webinar. The best way to stay tuned is to become a member, and then you'll get our emails. But you can also follow us at Birthrights Bar Association on Facebook. And with that, I want to tell you a little bit about Erin Michelle Williams, who is senior staff attorney at National Advocates for Pregnant Women. She is an experienced criminal defense and civil rights attorney. Currently, Erin's state-based projects include Alabama, Georgia, Mississippi, Oklahoma, and Tennessee. And her subject matter specialties include criminal law and policy, as well as maternal health disparities. Erin earned her JD from Rutgers School of Law, Newark, where she graduated, where she was a member of the Rutgers Law Review, and she got her BA in English. Shout out to those with the BA in English from Howard University. She's also a graduate of the National Criminal Defense College Trial Practice Institute in Macon, Georgia. She clerked in the New Jersey Superior Court Family Division and is admitted to practice in New York and New Jersey. Prior to her work at NAPW, she was a senior trial attorney with the New Jersey Office of the Public Defender. Erin passionately advocates for disempowered people and believes that her community is owed and deserving of the benefits and fruits of her education. So with that, I hand it over to you, Erin.
Thank you, Indra. Hi, everyone. I'm really pleased to be here to moderate. NAPW is a champion level sponsor for Black Maternal Health Week this year. And just to give a little background on Black Maternal Health Week, it is the annual, we are celebrating the second annual one, which is founded and led by the Black Mamas Matter Alliance. This week's aims are to bring awareness, activism, and community building intended to deepen the national conversation about Black maternal health in the United States, amplify community-driven policy, research, and care solutions, center the voices of Black mamas, women, families, and stakeholders, provide a national platform for Black-led entities and efforts on maternal health, birth, and reproductive justice, and enhance community organizing on Black maternal health. These values are embedded in the vision of National Advocates for Pregnant Women, as well as the Birthrights Bar Association. We are very happy to be allies in the movement for Black mamas. And to contribute our legal and support matter expertise to the conversation, we are bringing you this panel on racism, obstetric violence, and Black women's bodies. This topic is near and dear to NAPW and BRBA as we fight for the dignity, respect, and full human rights for all people, but in particular, pregnant people. The criminalization and punishment of Black bodies is a deep part of our country's ongoing legacy, and pregnant people are not excluded. Often, we as a community do not fully share these stories or discuss the trauma, the studies, or all of the solutions. So we hope this conversation will be another step towards healing through knowledge, organizing, and community building. And as a note, when we reference mamas or pregnant women, we are including all people with a capacity for pregnancy. And in line with Black Maternal Health Week, we want to always center Black mamas in the conversation. So I'm going to begin by proudly introducing and giving some background on our speakers, with our first speaker being Onika Bogle. Ms. Bogle is an assertive community treatment ACT case manager and a student pursuing her Master's of Professional Studies in Social Studies and Special Education. Shout out to the educators. Onika is a first-time mother to her son, Asher, a vibrant and witty 5.5-month-old. Picture here with her. Onika contacted NAPW after a traumatic birth experience of coercion, disempowerment, and gender-based inequality. And she recently provided testimony at the New York City Commission on Human Rights hearing in January 2019 on pregnancy and caregiver discrimination. And she wants to continue advocating and bringing awareness to the issue of racial discrimination and coercion, while disproportionately affects Black women in childbirth. So Ms. Onika will be our first speaker, but I'm going to go ahead and introduce our other speakers. Chinyere Opara is co-founder of Black Women Birthing Justice and co-author of Birthing Justice, Black Women, Pregnancy, and Childbirth, a seminal text that puts Black women at the center of debates about the crisis of maternal health care. She's lead author of Battling Over Birth, a human rights report that challenges existing research paradigms used to investigate Black women's perinatal health through a research justice framework. Chinyere received the Maternal Child Health Champion Award Visionary of the Year Award for this groundbreaking work. Dr. Opara became provost and dean at the faculty of Mills College in 2017. Again, shout out to the educators. And after serving for almost 20 years on the Mills faculty. Previously, she pursued a career in nonprofit administration, taught within the University of California system, and served as Canada Research Chair in Social Justice at the University of Toronto. Dr. Opara has edited and written numerous books, chapters, and journal articles on and including Global Lockdown, Race, Gender, and the Prison Industrial Complex, Outsiders Within, writing on transracial adoption and other kinds of dreams, Black women's organizations, and the politics of transformation. Thank you for all of your work. And finally, our other esteemed panelists will be Colleen Campbell, who is a PhD candidate in sociology and African American studies at Princeton University. Her research agenda broadly examines how law and medicine institute systems of domination in the medical context. She employs intersectionality, reproductive justice, and critical race lenses to illuminate reproductive subordination and stratified reproduction. Her current research examines racial disparities in obstetric and gynecological procedures. For her dissertation project, Colleen is studying Black women's maternal health experiences in New York City, which is her hometown. For this project, she is interviewing Black mothers, doulas, and providers, again, centering the women who are being impacted, midwives and OBGYNs, to shed light on the role of systemic racism and obstetric violence in shaping Black women's negotiation of birthing interventions and their maternal health experiences. This work examines issues of informed consent and refusal to illuminate how medicine operates as a site of racial subordination, resistance, and contestation. She received her JD from the UC Hastings College of Law, and prior to attending graduate school, she was a labor attorney in the District of Columbia. So we welcome you all, and I'm going to begin by Ms. Onika Bogle. I'm going to give you the floor to tell us a little bit more about your experience.
Thank you, Erin. Good afternoon, panelists. Good afternoon to everyone in our audience. Let's start with the beginning. We were thrilled to get our first pregnancy test after several unexplained miscarriages. We just couldn't figure out what was going on. And Asher was conceived, and we were excited. For the first time, it seemed like it was a viable pregnancy and everything was going well. We had plans, we had expectations. And one of the things that we were sure about was that we wanted as much as possible to have a natural delivery. So we started the process of reviewing birth centers. We didn't want to deliver in a hospital. So we started looking at birthing centers. We found one that we liked in Connecticut. We selected that one. Unfortunately, things did not go so well. I was diagnosed with an incompetent cervix requiring a cerclage, and subsequently went into labor prematurely. So Asher was born at 28 weeks and 6 days to be exact. That was from our gender reveal. We found out we were having a boy, the photograph. Fast forward, we ended up at Columbia Hospital. Oh, let me just pause to reflect on this photograph. This was 3 weeks before Asher was born. This was the last photograph that I actually took while I was still pregnant. I started to experience unusual cramping, and I knew I had the cerclage in place, so I was concerned, and I wanted to make sure that everything was okay. I'm originally, during my pregnancy, I received care with Montefiore, but at the time I was actually in Westchester, and we decided to just go to the nearest emergency room. At that time, it was Lawrence Hospital. Lawrence Hospital is affiliated with New York Presbyterian. And while there in the emergency room, we were told that Lawrence Hospital did not have the capability to provide care for a high-risk pregnancy, and they were unable to get in touch with my doctor at Montefiore. So the consent was that I would be transferred to New York Presbyterian Hospital in Manhattan. And so that was done. I got to New York Presbyterian about 2 a.m. On Sunday morning, and I was placed on monitoring. And by Monday afternoon, so what was happening was that Asher's heart rate was very irregular. What was later diagnosed as a Cat3 tracing. For those in the medical field, you may understand. But by Monday, everything was back to normal, was preparing for discharge. And in the process of that, my amniotic sac broke. So one of the first steps that they wanted to do was to remove the cerclage because of the risk of infection. We consented to that. The cerclage was removed. And then the doctor told us that I seem to have already contracted an infection, so they wanted to proceed with labor and delivery. And so I was started on Pitocin. By the time they had initially removed the cerclage, I was already 2 centimeters dilated, I was told. And a few hours passed, and I was told that I was no longer progressing, even though I was at 1 minute. I'm sorry, like 9 centimeters, I think. And the doctor told me I needed to do a cesarean section at that time. Of course, we refused because that was not the plan that we had in mind. I requested for them to keep trying, and unknown to us, they had stopped the Pitocin. So for 2 hours, we were in the hospital. No one was talking to us. We didn't know what was going on. I was no longer getting a medication, even though I was not aware of it, and didn't know what to do. So I called 911, and the police came to my bedside. Oh, prior to that, a psychiatrist came in. I didn't know who the person was. I was just told that this person needed to speak to me. I refused, and then after that, I called 911. I was able to speak to the medical director, and after about 3 hours, we were able to restart the medication, and Asher was delivered naturally, healthy baby boy. And I just want to show you a portion of a video that we recorded from that incident.
Yes, thank you, Onika. So I'm about to play a portion of the video as described of Onika's birthing experience. It's 5 minutes long, so I'm going to start it a little bit sooner if that's okay, Onika.
Yes.
Okay. So
And feel free to narrate throughout if you would like.
unusual pressure in my pelvis. So I went to Lawrence Hospital, which was closer to me at the time. Lawrence is not affiliated with Montefiore. They didn't have, the doctor there did a sonogram and explained to me that because I'm a high risk patient, he didn't have the equipment there to see what was going on. So he transferred me here. I got here Sunday morning and was monitored, put on the monitor for tracing. My baby's heartbeat is irregular. That's been happening since Sunday morning, 2 a.m.
Aaron, I think when you muted yourself, you muted the video.
Couldn't leave the hospital because of the risk.
Thank you.
And the doctor then decided that the best thing to do would be to remove the cerclage to prevent an infection spreading to the baby.
Yes.
Which I agree with, because it was the right thing to do. This morning, the doctors came back and they said that they wanted to induce labor because they wanted to remove any chance of the baby being infected.
Yes.
I agree.
Okay.
And was placed on Pitocin. At the time that they removed the cerclage, I was already 2 centimeters down. The first check when they started the Pitocin, I progressed to 4 centimeters. And then the second check, I progressed to 7 or 8, the doctor said. And
so what we hear you doing right
during
as
that
well is
exam,
explaining to these police
actually
officers
feeling
your past few hours in the hospital, correct?
I had to ask him to stop because it was extremely painful. And he said that the baby hasn't progressed further down the birth canal, and he's recommending cesarean section. I have already had this discussion since I came in that I wanted to try a natural delivery as much as possible.
Yes.
There is an authorization for a cesarean section on file that I signed, but the first option I wanted was to try for natural. And
Just to interject, the doctor who just came into the screen is actually the medical director who actually came up with the police officers.
Okay.
And for 2 hours, I've been lying like this without the medication that is done.
So basically, you still want to try to have a natural birth.
Yes.
That's what I'm understanding. The doctors who know best in that situation then will do.
The reason why I call you is because I don't know what else to do. And I need for there to be a record that, first of all, they call the psychiatrist. I'm not crazy. I just want to try to have that in the natural. This is my first time. And it's not fair for me to be forced to do a procedure. And I explained to him, if you had just taken the time to read my chart, you would have known that what you're seeing on the tracing is not unusual for my baby. Because that's been going on since Sunday.
Okay.
And putting me under stress is not going to help this heartbreak. It's going to make it worse.
Yeah, that's not good. It's usually.
Actually, if you don't mind if I interject, I'm actually probably a good person for you to go ahead and speak to and move the police. So I represent the hospital administration. So if you
called the police because I needed a report. That's why I called.
Okay.
Because nobody has been listening to me. Instead of listening to me, he went and got a psychiatrist because if he found that I was incompetent, they wanted to go ahead with the surgery. I'm not. I don't have a mental illness. I don't take medications for a mental illness. I'm a sane person. I just want to have a child naturally, as much as possible. I want to be given the opportunity.
Okay, I
But it's
understand where
been
you're coming
2
from.
hours.
So at this point on, because you called up, it's down in the 911 system, and it's gonna be there.
Not sure.
And record.
Yeah, hello?
It looks like that's the end of the video.
Great. Thank you. Ms. Bogle, do you want to supplement or describe further what happened after the video ends?
So basically, by calling the police, I was able to speak with the medical director for the hospital. Well, actually, the entire administrative staff came in, and I was able to voice my concern. The medical director and the assistant were the ones who actually delivered Asher that day. So we were able to explain to them that we wanted to keep trying as much as possible. She told us what the concern was for the tracings, and we explained again that we were aware that this has been going on, and that we did not think that it was significant to have a major surgery. She listened to us and restarted the Pitocin, and Asher was delivered without complications at all. But it was a very traumatic experience, and one that should never have happened in the first place had the doctor at the time, who was actually doing the delivery, had just listened to our concern and allowed us to at least try.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Bogle, for the courage to share with us not only the video, but pictures of your family and your entire experience. And we're very happy to hear that everything with Asher is wonderful, that he's doing well, and that you are as well. I'm going to try and advance. Unfortunately, my computer is frozen. I'm going to try and advance the slideshow momentarily. Dr. Opar, you can begin, and I will try to keep up with. I'll try to catch up once my computer stopped freezing.
Okay, so I'm going to start. We can't see the slides yet. Is that what we're saying?
Yes, my computer is frozen.
Okay, no worries. Hi, everyone. Well, first of all, I just want to obviously thank the Birthright Bar Association and National Advocates for Pregnant Women for creating this space. I think it's so important that we have what I call, legal allies or dissident lawyers. I'm not sure which one to go, to supporters of this work. And it's powerful that we're having a conversation about racism and violence, because I think even 5 years ago, that was not the conversation. Maybe the terms might have been multiculturalism and diversity, right? And now we're beginning to recognize that actually it's a lot more violent than that. So I want to start out by just saying a little bit about myself and how I came to this work very briefly, and then I want to talk a lot about the work that Black Women in Birth and Justice are doing and how we see the kinds of community-based work that needs to happen to really make meaningful change happen. As Erin mentioned, I have a background as an academic, an activist scholar, as well as community organizing background. Those are the two pieces of my career. But I came to this work very much like Anika, actually. And Anika, I want to thank you so much for just your courage for sharing that story. It's such a vulnerable and painful and difficult time to share that, and knowing that as Black women oftentimes want to be, so we can move to the next slide. We want to hold on to that identity as a strong Black woman who can handle things and hold our families together. And it's difficult to share when our vulnerability was abused in that way. So thank you for sharing that. And so I came to this work in a very similar way. I ended up in hospital a couple of weeks after my pregnancy, after I found I was pregnant with OHSS, a very severe case, which can be life-threatening. And it labeled me, marked me as at risk. And of course, as Black women, we have many at-risk markers. Just being Black walking into the office of an OBGYN, it puts an at-risk marker at us. For myself, I was 40. AMA, advanced maternal age, is another at-risk label. And then having had this early pregnancy medical experience. And so for me, it was a struggle throughout the whole experience of my pregnancy to be listened to as somebody who had some ideas about what I wanted to see in my prenatal care and during my birth, as opposed to simply a problem that had to be operated on, as Anika mentioned, right? The idea that somehow we're just this problem that has to be got out of the way so we can get this healthy baby out. So that was very much my experience, and I think so many of us from various different backgrounds, as we know, obstetric violence, racism in the birthing situation does not respect class, does not respect income, professional background. You can be empowered, educated, you have a PhD, which I do, and many graduate degrees, and ultimately you're just a Black body in that situation. And so I really want to affirm your story, Anika. So I want to talk a little, we could go to the next slide. I want to talk a little bit about how we at Black Women Birthing Justice believe we need to have a holistic approach to transferring the crisis in the maternal healthcare system, and in particular the human rights violations that are happening against Black women and other women of color and other pregnant persons. Going back a bit, if we remember the civil rights movement, and I think about a wonderful organizer, Ella Baker. Ella Baker, of course, was very involved with the young people and founded SNCC, and she is known for the creation of a concept called participatory democracy. And that is a concept that means that the people who are most directly impacted by something need to be the ones who mobilize and organize to bring about that change. And she once famously said that we can't rely on legalisms to bring about civil rights for Black people in this country. And she did not mean that lawyers were not a critical part of the civil rights movement. Of course they were, but what she meant was that lawyers on their own, without a grassroots movement and the strength of people power, will never bring about the change that we need. We need to have that mass swelling of mobilization to then push the courts and also to push implementation of those rulings that are made in the courts. And so that's very much the framework that I think about with maternal health care, which is another civil rights crisis for the Black community as well as other pregnant persons, including trans folks. So for us, when we think about Black Maternal Health Week and we talk about centering the voices of Black women in the maternal health care conversation, that's central. And as we know, many of our allies in the legal field are not Black women. And so what is the partnership that needs to happen to create space for the voices of Black women who are the most directly affected by this crisis? And then how do we get those voices and the stories to the forefront so that we can use those both to influence the courts and also to influence the implementation of rulings that come out of the court, so there actually is something meaningful in terms of change in our communities. And so we want to talk about centering the voices of Black women in the struggle against obstetric violence and birth injustice. We want to talk about the ways in which it's about grassroots mobilizing, and for us, a lot of that, of course, in the 21st century is, we do our bit in the streets, but we also do a lot on Facebook, right? There's a lot of digital media activism, it's Twitter. Apparently it's Snapchat. I'm a little bit too old for Snapchat, I think. But and then how we have mobilized stories, that our stories, Anika started out, I think it was really appropriate that she started, our stories of what happens to us, which I think many people find almost unbelievable, except that they're real, because when we've shared many of the stories that we've gathered, people have been just in shock, crying. What we've gone through is one of our most powerful assets in this movement to create change. And then to go ahead, and I want to just talk briefly about a report, human rights report that Black Women Birthing Justice. I was honored to work with the women in that organization to create, based on the over 100 African-American women, African and Caribbean women in California and their experiences with the crisis in maternal health care. So we can move forward to the next slide. So quick snapshot, won't say too much about this. It's other to say, introduce you to Black Women Birthing Justice if you don't already know the organization. We're based out of California, but we do work nationwide. And, there's two key pieces that, we are disproportionately impacted by unnecessary medical interventions and coercion and violence. And we're also disproportionately impacted by forced separation from our children, which of course is a continuation of the disruption of Black families that we've known for centuries and generations. And so this is our logo, and at the bottom you actually see Black Mamas Matter Alliance. We wanted to give them a shout out. We are a kindred partner of the Alliance, and they're doing so much important work to raise the visibility at a nationwide level. And so these are two spaces in which we've been able to put forward the stories that we believe could be so transformative: Birthing Justice and Battling Over Birth. Birthing Justice is a collection of 21 stories and critical essays by scholars, but also pregnant women, midwives, doulas, activists, advocates. And Battling Over Birth, which I already mentioned, is a human rights report based on a research justice project or participatory research project. We can move to the next slide. So just a little bit about why is research an important civil rights issue for us? Why is it a human rights issue for us? And many of you will be familiar with the image here, the syphilis. This is the Tuskegee syphilis study, which subjected nearly 400 African-American men in between 1942 and 72 to a research study that actually meant death for many. They were denied medical treatment even when it became clear that syphilis actually could be successfully treated, so that they could find out what happened in the Black body when syphilis goes through its full term. And of course, we don't often talk about the women that they were married to and the children that they had during that time who were also impacted. So this is obviously probably the most egregious and well-known case of research injustice, but this is really the backdrop to the way in which research is carried out today, in the sense that if you look in the blue, that's really the continuation of that research injustice or traditional research paradigm. We are reduced to bodies. Our medical records are mined for data without our consent. Nobody asks us if they can look at our medical records or our birth or death data, and that's used in an aggregate way. And we are not seen as thinkers, the knowers, the knowledge holders, and certainly not co-researchers who are most impacted and therefore should have the right to create that research. And so we in Black Women Birthing Justice have adopted research justice, which is a methodology that shares the tools and skills with the community members who are directly impacted so that they can create the change and find out what's happening in our communities and how can we document that and how can we get that out there. What's important and powerful here is that unlike pursuing a single case that may or may not rise to the attention of the general public, when you have a grassroots research process of gathering stories and telling stories, it leads to action, broad-based community mobilizing, and a highly public impact. And that's, we have to think about how we can bring together legal change and public impact and organizing. And we can move to the next one. So when we think about medical obstetric violence and coercion, it's not in a vacuum. Many Black women know about some of these statistics, and they vary by state, but they're all pretty much telling the same story. Our babies are born too small and too soon. They're more likely to die in their first year than a white baby. We are more likely to die during pregnancy or afterwards, the story goes on. What we don't often think about is what does that do to a community that is beginning to become knowledgeable about that? And so this is a quote from the report. "I was really scared about labor. That was my biggest worry, that I would die or the baby would die. So because of that, I decided to have a medical birth. I was so scared, it was hard for me to feel empowered about the process." So when we walk into that hospital setting in labor, there's a whole layer of fear that makes us vulnerable to the kind of coercion that we're likely to experience. And that's a part of thinking about obstetric violence and the ways in which Black women become disempowered And we can move to the next slide. And so Battling Over Birth found that this culture, this sense of fear created a culture of fear that really perpetuated coercion in the birth situation. And the kinds of stories that we heard were women being told, well, you don't want a back of the bus baby. What does that mean? It means that the idea sorry, you don't want a little bus baby, the idea that you might have a disabled child. Or you want a live baby, don't you? Isn't that the most important thing? So you must have a C-section without considering there are other options available. For most of the women, and many of the women in the study, this meant that birth, what your most vulnerable moment, actually became a battle with their medical care providers. And so what it means for us is that when we think about those cases that do rise to the surface, where you have an individual who has the courage and the passion to actually seek to make that 911 call, to seek legal recourse, it's the tip of the iceberg. There are so many more Black women who are experiencing this kind of fighting to have any kind of respect and empowerment during their birth experience. And why? Because of the experiences of unwanted, unnecessary medical interventions, poor prenatal care, and barriers to the kind of healthcare providers who might create a more listening and supportive environment. One of the results of this we found was that many of the Black women wanted to have a home birth. They wanted to simply escape from the maternal healthcare system. So that was a sort of fleeing from what they perceived as a broken system that was likely going to force them into an experience that they did not want. It also, another outcome was that it created a lot of trauma, because women who've gone through this kind of coercion and violence, after they go home with an infant and a newborn, and now you're going through the experience of lack of sleep and the normal part of early motherhood, if you are now processing trauma both in your body and in your emotions, it's very challenging. And so the lack of postpartum support to recognize that birth trauma is a real part of navigating those first 6 weeks. So we can move to the next slide. When we looked at various different areas in the birthing experience, and one of the things we did was that we created an Instagram and Twitter campaign to highlight some of these findings, because apparently we all have an attention span of about, is it 30 seconds now? So everyone's not going to read the report. So if you're a tweeter, please tweet some of these things. And there's plenty more on our website. Just wanted to throw some of those up there on the right-hand side of the slide. You see that. So you see here some of the issues. I'm not going to go through all of them, but just looking at the ways in which violence, in intimate violence, in relationships, violence, and stress in the environment that many of the Black women that we spoke to lived in really came into interaction with the kinds of coercion and violence they experienced in the birth experience. And so there was a re-triggering, a re-traumatization, but also for some women it was just too familiar. These are not new experiences to experience being denied autonomy, having one's body choices taken away from one, and even experiencing physical violence and pain. So we can move to the next one. And so here's a list of some of the just everyday things that happen. Anika talked about the way in which being forced into having a C-section is a form of violence. Oftentimes that's not considered a form of violence. In fact, it's considered to be, saving the person and the baby. But these things were happening just on a routine basis. And we had women talking very graphically about, the doctor came in, it was a new doctor, I hadn't seen that person before. They put their hand in my vagina and they grabbed and twisted the bag, and I could feel the bag of water was broken. Like that kind of extreme intervention in any other context, right? I'm walking on the street, somebody comes up and puts their hand in my vagina and tries to change something that's going on in me, they're immediately arrested, hopefully. And yet in the hospital setting, there's a normative sense of a lowering of the kinds of consent that women have to give. Some of the other things that women talked about was just how difficult it was to being forced to labor in a position that was excruciatingly painful, so unnecessary pain and discomfort. Being denied the opportunity to push, being told you can't push, despite the fact that there's a baby in the birth canal because the doctor's down the corridor and not available yet. So this kind of environment is really endemic in terms of the coercion and violence that women are experiencing, not something that is simply one or two extreme cases that are different from the normative experience for women. We could move on. And I talked a little bit about this already, so I probably won't stay here, but just also recognizing all of the psychological and physical impact of those kinds of traumatic experiences and how that impacts parenting, breastfeeding, and those first 6 weeks. Something that we're not paying enough attention to, thinking about the impact on the child, the mother, and the family when we look at these experiences of obstetric violence. You can move on. So just wrapping up to say that we're grateful for all of our allies and the work that everyone's doing. And one of the things that I think we can all do is become more informed about what is happening by listening to Black women. And so how are some of the ways that people can do that? Perhaps come together with the group that you work with or a group that you're in community with, and create a reading group and read Battling Over Birth, read the stories together, discuss what it means, talk about how you've seen some of the similar things or different things in your own practices. Get that context so that there is that awareness not only of the cultural context, but also of the racism, and so that you're equipped to support Black women. Black Women Building Justice and Black Members Matter Alliance are absolutely there to support and ally and be in partnership and provide information. That's one of our goals. Oh, by the way, I'm wearing the Black Women Building Justice t-shirt. Here's our beautiful t-shirt. You can go online, you can order a t-shirt, you can get the books, you can support our work. We're a grassroots organization. We have here some ideas about, well, who's in the room? How can we support having additional birth workers of color, and how can we support organizations that do that work, seek them out? How can we provide resources for them? And then for those of you who are up to date with the 21st century, you can follow us on Twitter and Instagram and really raise the profile of what's going on. Let everyone know about this webinar, get people to tune in and watch it afterwards. There's many more. We're doing webinars for throughout this whole Black Maternal Health Week. So let's make an effort to use this as a moment to really transform awareness and get people connected to what's happening at the grassroots and to listen to Black women. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Opar. It was a perfect way to, well, first, you really followed Onika's experience with a lot of information. So we want to make sure that you know that you can, if you have any questions, go to the bottom of your screen and put any questions that we will have divide a segment for question and answers at the end of this. So go ahead, start to put that in there so we can address those.
And if I may also just to say that if people do want to get the Battling Over Birth book, which is a Kindle as well as a book this week, there is a Black Maternal Health Week, BMHW is the discount code for 25% off at the website for the press. So that's a good opportunity to buy it in bulk and have a set up a reading group and start educating people.
And who doesn't want a discount, right?
Right.
Right. And so, and all of your information and experiences are a perfect way to lead right into our final panelist, Colleen Campbell, who, as introduced before, has studied this topic. So Colleen, I'm going to hand the floor over to you.
So thanks a lot, Aaron and Indra, for inviting me to participate today. I'm really honored to share this space with all of you. Thanks to Dr. Para for leading the way and all of the work that you've done, and Onika for sharing your experience. So I am coming to this as a big in the beginning stages of my research, and from a sociological perspective. And so the focus of my research is on obstetrics violence and looking at issues of informed consent and coercion in obstetrics. And if you can go to the next slide, Ninja. The real reason why I'm doing this is to highlight the actual impact that it has on Black women. And so these are some of the women that we've lost recently who've featured prominently. And I think it's interesting, I put Shalon Irvin up there because she was a social epidemiologist and she studied racial disparities in health and, did everything conceivably right, and yet still she didn't survive pregnancy. And I, talk about Erica Garner because her father also died prematurely from, systemic racism and state violence. And I think that these are all instances of premature Black death. I think that, I want to just highlight, this is the reason why I'm studying all of these issues of coercion and how it impacts Black women. If you can continue with the next slide. Okay. So I talk a lot in my research. I'm exploring a lot of issues in terms of historical practices, like Dr. Opara mentioned the syphilis study. Going even further back in history, we know that gynecology, it was established on the backs of Black women, essentially. And so, I also want to highlight these women who are centered in this depiction. Anarcha Westcott, Lucy Zimmerman, and Betsy Harris. These are the Black women who have been renamed the mothers of modern gynecology. So they're being juxtaposed against J. Marion Sims, the father of modern gynecology. And I talk about all of these historical practices. We know that Sims operated on slaves in his slave hospital without anesthesia. And part of the reason why he did that was because Black people didn't feel pain the same way. We had a higher threshold of pain and higher pain tolerance. And so these practices of racial subordination were built upon this fundamental idea that Black people were distinct anatomically. Black women had more obstetrical hardiness, and so somebody like Anarcha Westcott could withstand 30 surgeries and still there is no recognition of her humanity. And one of the things that I like to highlight is that these were also teaching institutions, and so were really theaters that white men came and watched these surgeries. These are white women who Black women who were in positions that no white woman would ever be subjected to. These degrading, dehumanizing positions where they came and they touched them and they just violated their bodies. And in this time period, this would be unheard of for a white woman to be subjected to this dehumanization. And so I talk about these historical practices because I see the same types of issues emerging in my study, in particular issues of teaching hospitals and just the callous disregard for clinic patients. When I talk to doulas and midwives and who worked in these hospital contexts, they talk about just the routine disrespect and just this presumption that if you're a clinic patient, then it's okay to just come and disrespect patients in these settings. And I do have cases where, in fact, residents admitting to these nurses or midwives that I interview, they admit that they're performing these procedures just to learn. And in the case of forceps deliveries, these women are getting them just so that somebody could satisfy this requirement in their residency program. And so, and there's this real surreal continuation of these historical practices of just dehumanization. I still see in my research the diminishment and dismissal of Black pain when women are pressured into having these procedures or interventions, like Dr. Opara mentioned. When they start complaining about the trauma in their body, they're dismissed and told, that they're either crazy, they're told to see a psychiatrist, or told to take Tylenol, and they're being sent home to die, literally. And so I try to connect these historical practice to the contemporary issues in my study. If you can go to the next slide. And so I also try to highlight some of the hypocrisy and the inconsistencies. A lot of the excuse around Black women's, the racial disparities, a lot of the coded language that we see is that, hospitals are dealing with high-risk populations. And so this is a way to obscure the fact that hospitals are engaging in high-risk practices. And they're disparately exposing Black women, poor women to risky interventions. And so, it's this very nefarious thing where they pressure women into having these procedures, and you see in all of these disparities in outcomes, and then you blame them for reflecting this, for experiencing trauma and for all of these things that we see play out in Black women's bodies. And so, you know, this is all in the same way that we see it in other areas, in other right, in other forms of coded language, dog whistles. We're seeing it in the healthcare context as well. And it's all to obscure the systemic racism and the obstetrics violence that's happening in hospitals. And, you know, the main point that I try to highlight is that there's nothing wrong with Black women's bodies. In terms of all of these like disparities that we're seeing, right? Black women don't need to be fixed. Right. What really needs to be fixed are hospitals and how providers see Black people and Black women as clinical objects instead of fully humans deserving of respect. And I think that that's something that I try to emphasize in my research as well. If you can continue the slide. So, you know, this is just one of the other sides of SIMS where we see that, right, this was created in the 1970s, right? There's this aesthetic pleasure over like memorializing, you know, like this, like medicine, this space where Black women were, you know, completely, you know, subordinated and viewed as like objects of like white male dominance. And so this picture was not even done in like antebellum era, but somebody needed to like derive pleasure over the medical giants of Alabama. And so this is what it means for Black women to be incorporated into gynecology and obstetrics as an object. And so, you know, I try to juxtapose this image with the last image, Indra. No, forward. Right. So, you know, right, we, you know, in the same, right, we're talking about all the violence that Black women are experiencing, but also there are spaces of resistance, refusal, like Miss Onika, who, you know, there are a lot of women who have to go through extreme lengths in order to get their needs met and to assert themselves. And it's unfortunate that it has to be this extreme, but Black women are also resisting all of these power impositions. From, you know, on the extreme left are these youth protesters who got J. Marion Sims' statue to be removed. And then you have Fannie Lou Hamer, who also, you know, was a victim of coerced sterilization and still, you know, she politicized that experience. And then I call her Dr. Williams, or Serena Williams, who basically, she said, I know my body, listen to Dr. Williams. And so even in the midst of the violence, I see creative spaces of resistance. And of course, you know, we need the doulas and we need to have more robust institutions. But, you know, I still see that Black women are still fighting for, you know, their survival. So that's I'll end there.
Great. You're right. We're all women, but especially Black women, are always fighting for our survival, especially in these types of settings. And at this point, we have a few more minutes, and I want us to move right into a few questions. It looks as if there's a healthy conversation occurring in the webinar chat, but I don't see any specific question to the topic that has been addressed that hasn't already been answered. So I'm just going to move in to a few questions, but please feel free to put it in there. If you have a question, this is the time to put it in so we can get it answered for you. I want to go back to Onika. Can you describe a little bit, Onika, how you knew that calling the police to your bedside would be helpful? Like, how did you know that would be an act that would be able to be helpful in that situation? Because I don't think many people would know to do that.
Unmuted. Thank you. Actually, that knowledge came from my experience as an ACT team case manager. The ACT team works with persons with serious mental illness. Mm-hmm. So part of my work is to ensure that they are taking medications and that they're fit to continue living in the community. So we are an umbrella care provider, outpatient, and oftentimes in my work, our clients will resort to calling 911 for any particular reason. They may just not want to take medications that day, and they feel coerced into taking medications. And usually the response is very effective. Everybody turns up when 911 is called and the police shows up. And also, as part of our training, we are trained to be aware that a 911 call almost immediately brings the attention of supervisors and administrative staff. So I thought, why not give it a try at that particular.
Good for you, right? Who would have thought that you would have ever had to do that, right? In so many circumstances, calling the police is actually more danger to us, right? In situations where we're already being additionally surveilled, policed, and criminalized, and go figure.
Yeah, I wanted to also add, just in terms of that you know, in our study, sometimes Black women's male partners were being criminalized for trying to stand up for them in that setting. So they were saying, can't you hear her? She said no. She said no 4 times. You need to back off. And they were being seen as aggressive, potentially violent. And in one instance, the partner was banned and told that they would call the police if he continued to try to advocate for her. So I think that that's also, you know, that, I mean, there's a is it between a rock and a hard place, right? That we want to call on some entity that's supposed to perhaps defend us from one form of violence, but they actually are perpetrators of another form of violence. And so it's not always a safe choice for Black women to do that, particularly if their family members may, or themselves may end up being criminalized in that situation.
Right, good point. Wonderful point. And actually goes into another question I think we can go right into, Dr. Opara, about what other types of coercive strategies. I think one would be potentially the threat of your partner that is with you, or family members potentially being criminalized as well. What are the coercive strategies, whether interpersonal, institutional, structural, that hospitals or providers employ to increase interventions?
Well, I think the first point is to say that consent is inadequate. It's supposed to be informed consent, which means that you're supposed to, A, fully understand what the potential impacts are, side effects, et cetera, what the intervention is, and that you're supposed to be able to say yes freely. And that's not from what we studied really happening. First of all, women are not being given, or pregnant persons are not being given full information before they're in the intensity of labor. And so when you're in the intensity of labor and somebody says, okay, we are now going to do X, because otherwise, you know, your baby's at high risk and 10 people have just run in your room, that's not a moment when you can weigh the benefits and disadvantages of a particular intervention. So one thing is that we talked about bringing informed consent upstream so that people are given full disclosure beforehand. None of the women were told, for example, epidural is so common. Nobody was told that epidural could fail, that it could have unexpected consequences. Some people talked about feeling chest constriction, not being able to breathe. That's actually one of the side effects that can happen with epidural. And yet nobody was informed about that. So I think that's a starting point, that people are being pushed into things without being told this is what could possibly happen. And then secondly, they're not told the full range of options, right, that they might actually take. But I think the other piece is that there are, you know, as we mentioned on the slides, you know, multiple interventions that appear smaller but actually accumulate. So we call that the kind of cascading impact. So for example, they decide that you need to have an internal monitor. So now you have to be completely on your back throughout your labor. A lot of women talked about, I was forced to be still on my back. So of course I was in excruciating pain. That's not a natural way to give birth. And so then I had to go for the epidural. Then because the epidural, I couldn't feel, I couldn't push, and so then I failed to progress. And then I ended up having a C-section. So what apparently might be a small benign intervention upstream can end up leading to others. So I think those are some of them. But really, I think just the emotional abuse associated with and creating a climate of terror at a moment when somebody's at the most vulnerable.
Great, and that's a perfect segue into a question I have, and I think it's relevant for you, Colleen, but anyone can answer because many of us are lawyers on this on the webinar. But in general, just as people functioning in any medical setting, we understand consent, right? We feel affirmed by whether or not we can consent to many things, whether there's a picture being taken, but most certainly whether or not we are going to be subjected to levels of testing or forcible cesarean surgeries. So Colleen, can you describe, however, because I do want us to have some type of solution base or a discussion on these issues with an interdisciplinary approach or a lens, whether it's legal, policy, organizing, or medical, about what Black women in particular are doing to resist the violence and taking their power back. Is having a doula or a midwife or those alternatives that we should be exploring, and to what degree, and how helpful is that, along with, frankly, Black doctors, Black OBGYNs in birth settings, but even beyond potentially too?
I think that, those are some of the issues that I'm still trying to work out as well, because when we think of like some of these actors in the medical setting, right, they're not all white doctors or all white nurses. And so, we have to think definitely beyond like the individual, actors within the system, and think in terms of like institutional conditions. And so, I think that, I think it's right, having more Black doctors is I think I think it could be, it helps, but I'm not going to say that's a solution, because it's too, overly simplistic. And so I think that we have to think about how, the medical profession lacks a lot of like humility. And what I'm talking about is doctors who, they know best, and they don't listen to women when women say what's going on in their bodies. And so there's no respect for women's expertise in their own bodies. And this is how all of these issues happen, where, for example, with Serena Williams, she's saying, I'm having a blood clot, I know my body, and she's completely dismissed. And so just this, the whole inherent nature of medicine lacks humility. And I think that there has to be some, that has to be dealt with. And that's intrinsic to, I think, medicine. And so, I think that, doulas might be, I think having a doula for a lot of women, you go to a hospital with a 50% C-section rate. If you go there expecting to have a natural birth, you're probably gonna have it if you have a doula. But without a doula, you're probably not gonna have a natural birth. And so, I think that it's these are important support systems for each woman, but we have to talk about like how hospitals in Black communities run, and all of these like just structural issues as well. So, but I'm happy to hear from other panelists what they think.
Yeah, and I want to, as you reference Serena's experience about them not believing her, I want to again go back to the video that we watched of Onika and how they didn't believe her, right? They didn't believe her experience either. When she's saying, I know my body, I know that this is regular for my baby. And no one else in this room understands what's going on in me, inside of me or with him. And how they frankly all just ignore that. And that and Onika, I don't want to reiterate, like feel free to expound upon that, but I'm just thinking about one of the major takeaways I had when I was watching that you were very clear and articulate and were being completely ignored. And that even in the police officer response, which is not uncommon for police officers, but these are the people you reach out to come and help. Their response was, well, the doctors are going to know better.
Yes.
I think it's also really important to understand that from the medical provider's point of view, the woman is not the patient, the baby is the patient. Mm-hmm. So the woman's desire for a natural birth or not to have a C-section is not what's at stake in their minds, right? So I think that's really important. So there's an automatic way in which we become a body, right?
Yes.
I wanted to also just add that one of the Black Women Birthing Justice members, Karen Scott, describes herself as a recovering OB. And one of the women who wrote a piece for Birthing Justice, Christ-Anne Madois, who's a great VBAC activist in Florida, describes herself as a dissident OB. And so it's not enough to have a racial gender identity if you've been inculcated into a system of sort of basically white supremacist medicine. You have to also have an unpacking and unraveling and then take on that. I love the dissident concept. That's a really important one. And absolutely, we have to understand the barriers to accessing a doula, not just financial, but also cultural, and the ways in which, Black Women Birthing Justice has co-founded a a group called Roots of Labor, which are doulas of color who do sliding scale births for women of color. But in most areas, people don't know they even have an access to a doula of color or such a thing exists. And they're oftentimes seen as like a white thing that's not something that's relevant to our community. So there's just a lot of work there. But yes, absolutely. Those individuals who work with doula or a midwife had an enormously much better experience of their birth.
Great. And frankly, as a person who goes around as a lawyer and talks about these criminalizing and punishing places and experiences so many women are having, they are, as you mentioned, Dr. Parr, they are literally being taught that they have two patients. Right? I regularly, when I explain to them how you are separating in these medical settings, or you're truly separating a fetus at that time from their mother when you do these types of interventions, when you don't respect them and have dignity for them, you're separating them and you're only thinking truly about the fetus. And so commonly, especially from frankly, cisgender men who are in training for as medical students who are in training, they always say, but I have two patients. I have to take care of both of them. And I have to take sometimes care of the baby before her. And these are constantly examples over and over again. If we understand that stress comes into play, if we understand that the myth of pain, just to clarify, the myth of pain that Black women in particular can sustain, and that we don't need to, we can take down her dosages, how that contributes to what we're all here to discuss is the high rates of Black mortality, morbidity, and infant mortality. And the conversation just needs to be had.
I just want to say about the pain thing. My experience of the research that we did was that in the hospital setting, that's not the operating concept anymore. Now the idea is that we need to take all this pain away from you. There's no such thing as pain of the purpose. But what we need to remember is that for incarcerated women, that's absolutely still the operating idea. That any attempt to get pain relief, even in cases when women clearly do need it, like so you've been transported to a hospital during labor. This is not an ideal way to be being in labor. You're in excruciating pain. You need something. Oftentimes when you arrive, they're being denied on the grounds that they're simply seeking drugs, because as criminalized women, they're not considered to be legitimate, be able to give a legitimate testimony about their pain level without being manipulated and trying to get drugs. So I just wanted to bring incarcerated women into the conversation.
Great. And I do have one question that I want us to address as they're coming in. And I am trying to be respectful of people's time, so I know we're running over. Dr. Campbell and other panelists, can you think of other structural changes Black women and their allies might aim for in order to combat the current nature of obstetric care? I'm trying to think of big picture goals, such as securing places on hospital boards, good idea, interacting with the Joint Commission, regulatory solutions, and of course, speaking as a lawyer, targeted litigation. Thank you, Deborah Fish.
I would just say that we have probably about 5 pages of specific recommendations at the back of the Battling Over Birth report. But I agree with you. We talked about community accountability boards for hospitals as one of the examples.
I definitely think that there has to be more shift and support for women to have access to home birth midwifery care. I've said that I don't think that our dominant medical model is going to change, but I think that definitely when I speak to midwives, they'll say I don't have a maternal mortality rate because I listen to women when they speak, and I trust Black women, and I don't assume or make assumptions about where they're coming from, and there has to be a shift in our paradigm, or in the alternative, like when we have midwifery in the hospital system, that is actually there is an actual equal relationship, and midwives are actually listened to, and obstetricians are not just called for every case, because I think we think in the United States like this is the universal way in which birthing is done, and that's not the case. When you go to other countries, and even in Canada, and like midwifery plays a more important role in births, and why can't we have that in the United States? And there's a lot of issues there, but I think I'm actually serious about that. I was delivered by a home birth midwife in rural Jamaica, but then it wasn't, it's in the 1980s. It wasn't something that was a luxury good for like white people. This were like it was a poor working class community where, you know, the community midwife just delivered women, and the care was, I mean, it's fundamentally different, right? My mother had respectful care, you know, home birth, and it was, you know, I mean, compared to what she would have gotten in a New York City hospital as like a young Black woman is completely different, because of all the, you know, the white supremacy and so forth. But I think that there has to be some fundamental shift in how we approach birthing. That includes centering midwifery more. So
I agree. And if I can also add, I think when you mentioned, Deborah, securing places on hospital boards, part of that is to ensure that hospital policies are in line with all the things that we're saying, respect, dignity, right? And listening to their patients, in particular Black women, for the purpose of our conversation. And I think that is important because right now, in fact, NAPW is petitioning a Staten Island University hospital because they have failed to do that to some of their patients, because there was an unknown policy about, at the time of this woman delivering, there was an unknown policy about how long she could actually labor. And because of that unknown policy, they actually were able to get a court order and to force a cesarean surgery on her. So hopefully we are, as part of that, as part of being on hospital boards or other commissions and regulatory solutions, we can be encouraging and bringing to the table our knowledge around these things. And also, because I am a criminal defense attorney, we reminding ourselves of the fact that even beyond just hospital, well, no, even within obviously hospital settings, but women are being criminalized and punished related to their pregnancy and the pregnancy outcomes all the time. And so it's not just about these specific birthing spaces, but the entire time. And as a parent, before and after and during, and really having conversations at all places about the way that pregnancy is being criminalized, or someone's choice not to carry to term. It all impacts one another. And so I think that is also something that's important. And again, to be respectful of time, it is that time, and we need to end the webinar. So I would like for everyone to go around, beginning with Onika, with any parting takeaways that you may have, and then Chinyere, and then Colleen.
My experience is not unique to me, as has been mentioned previously. Far too many women like me are forced to deliver in substandard conditions. And the worst part is the trauma that comes after the experience. My son's birth was one of the most beautiful experiences. Unfortunately, that experience has been tainted by something that's just dark. And it's not something that we talk about, even though our son was born. So it's the first child for both of us. And we can't speak about the experience because it's just too dark and painful. And it should never happen, and it cannot keep happening. Parents ought to be able to choose and to have a pleasant experience while giving birth. And hopefully we can effect change. Yes.
Thank you. Dr. Opara.
Well, I want to say that it's powerful to be part of many conversations this week about the kinds of violence and human rights violations that Black women are experiencing on a regular basis. But we shouldn't have to have 1 week a year when this is something we worry about. So I want to encourage all of us to think about ways that this can become a conversation that's integrated throughout the year ahead. Maybe by the end of this week, make a commitment to, Black Maternal Health Week, make a commitment to 3 or 4 actions that you are going to move forward with and take into the work, so that this week is really just an incentive to get things moving. And so we all are doing an enormous amount. I know that, we're all working hard, and sometimes we're tired and we feel like we're overstretched, and we have a huge problem to tackle, broken maternal health care system. How can we individually do it? We can't do it individually, but I think that we collectively can make real change And certainly the women that came to our sharing circles and heard stories of empowering birth experiences from other women went away changed and said that I now know some strategies to go and defend myself. And in fact, I even know that I have to expect to defend myself and the birth is likely to be a battle. And so there's some changes that are happening right there. So I encourage everyone to create 2 or 3 action commitments for this week, share it with somebody, have an accountability buddy, and that way we can make this work move forward.
Great suggestions. And Colleen and Dr. Parr, if you have to hop off now, you are welcome to do so. We understand.
Thank you everyone so much.
Thank you. So, you know, I am always humbled when I enter these spaces. I have not given birth, and so I don't have that personal experience. I have, you know, had other experiences as a Black woman, and you know, I enter this space from this, you know, this understanding that throughout, like I think you were alluding to this, Aaron, it's like throughout, not just throughout pregnancy, but throughout our reproductive journey, there are any number of issues that can affect us as Black women. And so, you know, I care about us or how we survive pregnancy, and even beyond and before that. And for those women who don't actually, you know, go through pregnancy. And so, you know, I just want to thank all of the people that that have shared their experiences with me. Anika described it, you know, a lot of women are leaving pregnancy as it's like a war zone. It's a source of PTSD. And so I'm particularly humbled and grateful for those women who, you know, are still nevertheless sharing their stories and talking about their trauma. And I'm hoping that ultimately it can be like a source of healing and empowerment. And I think that, you know, Black women, we know how to do that. We are finding ways to assert our autonomy and to like empower ourselves collectively and communally. And so, you know, I hope to just continue in this journey and in this struggle with all of you all. So thanks again for having me.
Thank you all for joining us. I couldn't have said it better than anyone else has already said it, so I'm not going to try. Please stay tuned for additional, and by tuned I mean check your email, for any additional BRBA and NAPW webinars. And again, continue to support Black Mamas Matters, Black Mamas Everywhere, and happy Black Maternal Health Week.
Thank you. Bye.